Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, or to be here virtually. I'm going to be talking today about shipping. As you can see here, the title of the presentation, rather provocatively for this time in the morning, is In Deep Ship. And don't worry, I said ship with a P. And I'm going to be looking at the perfect waves that we think could hit global shipping going forward. And the way this presentation is going to be structured is like this. As we pull up at the harbour side, the contents are as follows. We're going to talk about the tidal wave that's hit shipping, then a phrase I would like to retire on the back off of, too big to sail, then a tsunami of politics, a Cold War freeze, the maritime past as maritime future, and finally wrapping it up with some conclusions for you. So let's dive straight in, shall we? Part one, which is global shipping hit by a tidal wave of demand. Now, if we think back to the crisis in the Suez Canal, it doesn't seem that long ago, we would like to believe that we could resolve all our shipping problems globally just as easily as we did that one, by basically sending down a giant hand and freeing that ship from the banks of the Suez Canal. Unfortunately, the problem that we have now is far larger than that, in far more dimensions. One of the key issues that we face globally is an overheated US economy relative to its logistical carrying capacity. So you can see here that US imports have absolutely surged, at least in dollar terms. Part of that is inflation, of course, and part of that is real volumes. And we know that we have a massive backlog of containers, particularly at the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach. That's largely because the US economy during COVID saw a shift to spending on goods and away from services, because everyone was pretty much locked up at home. And that problem has been echoed right the way around the world. If we look here at this animation, you can see the to and fro between Asian supply and US demand. And look what happens when you get extra demand thrown into the mix. You suddenly end up with a queue to get into US ports. Then you throw in bottlenecks outside the port, which I'll come back to in a moment, COVID-related worker shortages, which of course are still evident in many places, and you start to get cascading failures down the supply chain, which exacerbate the problem. Now, Drewry think that box port capacity could remain tight through to 2025. So some people might be thinking about 5 months. Others are thinking about another 3 or 4 years. Maersk is saying the only way to resolve this is by US consumer demand softening. Well, that sounds a bit like a recession to me. I don't think any politician wants to see that. And on the Asian side, of course, we have COVID still filtering through ports and supply chains there. China looks like it may be about to go into more lockdowns. We also have power cuts plaguing the Chinese economy in particular, and again, disrupting supply. So all in all, it's a pretty perfect storm. One other issue to stress here, it's not all about ships, it's about trucks too. For example, in the US and in much of the world, we're very short of truck chassis and drivers. In the US case, many truckers are now contractors who earn a flat fee per delivery, and they're having to wait for hours at ports and warehouses to pick up goods and drop them off. They're actually losing money per delivery, so of course they don't want to do it. And in the UK, in the EU, drivers are underpaid relative to the stress of the job, and they're also dropping out just when we need tens of thousands more of them. So in a simple sense, we can say there's no trucking way that we're going to solve this easily, certainly not just by looking at ships. Indeed, I was talking earlier about bottlenecks outside US ports, and that's very much the situation. If you presume this picture of cars and buses here was actually of ships, and those are trucks trying to come out the other side of the port, that's pretty much the problem. So the White House is now talking about everyone working 24/7 at LA Long Beach to try and get things moving. But unfortunately, that won't be enough unless we reform how the whole rest of the US economy is working. It won't help outside the dock. The Transport Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, says supply chain issues may last for years and years and doesn't seem to have a great deal of solutions for it. Top freight forwarders are talking about containergeddon, that's their phrase, not mine, lasting a very, very long time. I would concur, so would Pete Buttigieg. Shippers themselves are now worried about catastrophic fallout from a crazy Californian port fee, because this port of LA Long Beach is about to start charging $100 a day, rising $100 a day for every TEU which is still in the port, even if it isn't on board the ship, even if it's already been unloaded. So in other words, for a 10,000 TEU vessel, that's $1 million on day one in late fees, 2 million on day two, 3 million on day three. Now, even with the very high shipping costs we have now, if you're delayed for 3 weeks, which trust me is pretty normal at the moment, that will double the cost of shipping again, and someone is going to be paying for that. On top of that, look at energy costs. Now that's in Europe, and we have come down from the peak, even if you can't quite see it on that chart. We went up to nearly 120, which would have been an instant recession. We're currently at around 74, which is still up enormously on where we were during 2020 and 2019. And the simple matter here is we have to consider, does global trade even work at these prices? Because most free trade models assume zero or very low energy costs and zero or very low logistics costs, and we have very high both, and likely to be around for quite some time. So as a result, we've had the president of UPS openly saying, companies are coming to him and saying, where should we be manufacturing and assembling stuff? We now understand, belatedly, that long supply chains were always vulnerable, and we wish we hadn't gone along with them. Well, the problem is this, it's a bit late now, and is it economical to pay $20,000 US to ship $2 widgets? Probably not. But what if you can't make a $50,000 car without it or without them? When is it uneconomical to ship them? But how do you reopen a supply chain when all the rest of the supply chain is also absent? It's a very, very complex problem. So part 1 of 6, to wrap up, is that shipping snarls are probably here for years, not months. If we get more stimulus in the US or elsewhere, it will just make matters worse. Can inflation expectations stay low? If that's the case, and I would argue probably not, and or will supply chain shift? And the question is when and where and how? Which leads us to part 2, too big to sail. Now, if you think of banks, we used to talk about too big to fail. And then the executives were, of course, too big to jail afterwards. Well, too big to sail is the latest iteration, because we're probably well aware that within the industry, we're relying on ultra-large cargo vessels to carry more goods on a ship that's bigger than a US aircraft carrier. Why do we rely on them? Good old-fashioned economies of scale. The problem is, in a crisis like we have now, it exacerbates problems because not all ports can handle them. They're slow at sea, they're slow to load and unload, they're very complex, you have to maximize efficiency. They force inland logistics to adapt to them. So in other words, what these giant ships dictate, the whole rest of the economy has to match, or you get a logjam. It also forces hub and spokes global trade models. For example, if you're country X and you've only got small ports, you can't get in the loop with country Y and country Z who have got mega ports and mega ships. Lastly, of course, they're vulnerable to accident or disruption. They're designed for a completely peaceful global environment. Do we have that now? Maybe not, if you look at the background. So overall, they're the opposite of a resilient, flexible, distributed system. And if you were designing a system from scratch to be resilient, you wouldn't make it look like this. The problem really is we can't resolve where we are now just by adding more ships. We need to add more trucks, more truckers, more ports, more roads, more rails, more of everything. We won't be able to do those until we have a global map of production for the 21st century. As we build back better, are we building to make things in America or to make them in China or Europe or Japan or India, etc., etc., etc. Until we have a global plan for where we're going to be making things, we won't add logistics to resolve this supply chain constraint. And that takes leadership, and we don't have any. And so to wrap up part 2, we've built a too big to sail Titanic global shipping system. This is a schematic of the Titanic, by the way. It was unsinkable, wasn't it? Until it sank. So then part 3, a tsunami of politics is coming as a backlash, because you can't have a problem like we have now and not expect politics to be involved. First of all, LA Long Beach, which is the real center point of the crisis globally at the moment, they are going to try and automate. Probably around May next year, the workers there, the longshoremen, are going to go on strike as a result. So you can basically pencil in a new breakdown in shipping around the middle of next year. That's baked into the cake unless we see a really remarkable political breakthrough. In Europe and many other locations, we're talking about putting up tax on shipping to help it go green. That would be from 2023 in the case of the EU. Now, obviously, that will only increase costs. We don't know what technology will be acceptable to power ships, and we haven't developed it yet fully, so let's wait and see. But most urgently, back in July, the Biden White House introduced an executive order to address monopolies, oligopolies, and cartels in the US economy, which actually is objectively a very good thing to do. They're including within their remit global carriers, who are, of course, overwhelmingly European and Asian rather than American. Now, the shippers, of course, have collaborated closely for years because we all understand the industry is very volatile. You have good years and bad years. And the very flexible, streamlined system that they've built up together allowed them to make a profit in bad years. Well, now we have exceptional times and they're making mega profits. So America, which for decades encouraged this industry consolidation into what is effectively a cartel now, is pushing back and saying, we, the American government, believe we have the power to force carriers to change their business practices. That's already seeing shipping firms say, well, look, let's not rush to add too much new capacity because we're making so much money as things stand. And that's a key point to stress here. We have a supply chain problem, as you can see, but almost every major component part of that supply chain, apart from contracted labor in the trucking sector in the US, is actually making mega profits at the moment. So it's an extremely efficient system in terms of profitability. It just means ruin or extreme trouble for the real economy. Of course, that's where politics is going to come in. Back in August, for example, we already saw the US Congress float a bipartisan bill called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021, which will introduce reciprocal trade as part of the Federal Maritime Commission's mission. Now, that will change the US economy dramatically, if so, and the face of global shipping, given the US imports and doesn't export very much, certainly not in terms of manufactured goods. They're talking about minimum service standards. Okay, that's fine. They're talking about greater detail for demurrage charges. Fair enough. They're talking about shifting demurrage charges from the importer to the port or the carrier. Now, that's enormous if that were to happen. They're also talking about carriers not being allowed to turn down export opportunities from US companies. Again, that will delay everything even further, having to report data and fining you if you push back and don't follow these particular regulations. So that's enormously important. And we've already seen ocean carriers saying, look, this is doomed to fail because it's a protectionist race to the bottom. Fair enough. If you look at the lobby groups in America who are supporting this legislation, it suggests to me it could go through, at which point, yes, welcome to a protectionist race to the bottom, potentially. The key point here, to wrap up part 3, is you can say made in America or Europe or Japan or China or India or wherever, but it's complicated. You can't just reshape global shipping. You can't get from just in time to just in case. And just for me, just like that, it will just get messy, and it is getting messy. On which note, we turn to part 4, which is global shipping to potentially be hit by a Cold War. And here the water is freezing, of course. Now, we don't call it a Cold War in America. That's not politically correct. They call it extreme competition, whatever that means, between autocracy and liberal democracy. China states that US hegemony is over and it must adjust to a new world order. You look at Afghanistan, you can certainly see that things are changing and very, very fast. And this will, of course, involve shipping because selective decoupling of supply chains will be part and parcel of this process. But more importantly, If we get serious frictions over the South China Sea, over Taiwan, for example, it will hit shipping in a very, very big way. For example, look at this data here. That is the shipping cost, the freight rate for grain from New York City to Liverpool from the late 19th to the middle of the 20th century. Can you spot when World War I happens? It goes up 10 times. If you look at the second chart, it stays high well after World War I ends. So were we to see a geopolitical accident, you think shipping's expensive now? Try what it will be like were we to see that happen. Now, of course, it's only a fat tail risk, but it has to be flagged. Importantly, we also have this issue. Here's a US aircraft carrier. We break for no one. Now, if you ship anything from A to B, the only reason you don't worry about piracy in most locations and you don't worry about maritime protectionism is because the US Navy keeps the sea free and open and a level playing field, if you will, for all global players. It's done that since World War II. That's historically unprecedented. It costs America a lot of money to do that, despite the fact they have pressing domestic problems. We already know that the American fleet is aging and the Chinese fleet is soaring near Taiwan. I'll show you some data on that in a second. So America is already leaning on Australia and the UK, India and Japan to try and counterbalance. Here's the key point for commercial shipping. The US Navy is keeping the seas open for EU shipping, for example, even as the EU continually fails to back the US versus China. Now that could change, but at the moment they're trying to play both sides. Even more strange from a logical perspective, the US Navy is keeping the seas open for Chinese shipping, despite the fact they're in a Cold War with extreme competition. So one side is paying for the other. Here's that chart I told you about. That's in red, Chinese naval growth versus blue, US naval growth. Can you spot a little pattern there? I don't think you need to be much of a data expert to see what's happening in the region. That takes us back to the fat tail risks I was just talking about. But from a commercial perspective, linked to the military, here's what I want to stress. The US keeping the sea open for everybody is a continuation of its post-1945 role that assumes all global trade, for example, between the EU and China, is good for America. Why? The Democrats don't believe that, neither do the Republicans. So at some point, something will shift. And if we do get US economic thinking shifting along those lines, they're going to start saying, why are we paying for Chinese shippers to sell things to Europe and a European carrier to sell things to China? Why? Why are we paying for the Cold War neutrals? Why are we allowing foreign port and shipping ownership when it has real world implications for the American economy? And if we do see that happen, the implications are enormous. We've just seen, for example, a US lawmaker propose legislation discouraging the US purchasing Chinese container cranes for its ports. Even cranes are national security in the current environment. So wrapping up part 4, we have very fat tail risks for shipping. You can see that the structural paradigm we've had since 1945 is really, really starting to sink. And we hope that those fat tail risks don't emerge. So then part 5, let's look at the depths of maritime history to look forward to the future of global shipping and global carriers. Can it teach us anything? I think it can. Here we have America back when it declared independence. Its merchant marine helped it win that independence. The first congressional legislation in 1789 was a 10% tariff on UK imports, all arriving by ship, of course, to protect US shipping and US industry. And of course, the British and the Americans banned trading with each other by ships. So America's been here before, fighting against much larger maritime economies and powers than China is. It's in its blood to push back at some point, one would suspect. And if we look at the 18th and 19th century data here, the two lines you can see show the percentage of US trade being carried by the US merchant marine, both imports and exports. And the picture's fairly clear. It goes up under protectionism, it slides under war with the UK, it stays fairly steady even as the UK subsidizes steamships. It drifts off a little bit with free trade. When the US stops subsidizing steamships, it collapses, and then the Civil War pushes it over the edge, and they lose control of their own maritime marine, or at least maritime marine loses control of US imports and exports. And if we look at the 20th century, it's not a dissimilar picture. The dots here in orange show you the US maritime marine percentage of global fleet. So for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, it's only around 5%. Well, along comes World War I and we leap to around 23, 24. And the Jones Act in 1920 introduces cabotage to make sure that US shipping from one US city to another is only done by US ships with US crews. Then in the 1930s, it's all sold off during the Great Depression. In the late 1930s, World War II is looming, and the Merchant Marine Act insists we have to have a maritime marine for national defense. Notice how commerce at sea is national defense. Along comes World War II and Liberty ships, boom, the US has got a third of the global fleet. Post-World War II, they set it all off. Guess what? It's minuscule again today. Here's a report written by a US Strategic Studies Institute last year called Hidden Harbors. And here's the conclusion. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Please read it yourselves. But the key points which I will read out are that it's long overdue time for the US to reinvigorate its maritime industries. So argues this Strategic Studies Institute. The private sector cannot do it alone because in China, the government is supporting carriers and shipping. So therefore, the US needs to do the same. And the conclusion is if the US and allied governments, and that's a key point, who is or isn't an allied government, if they don't do the same, they could cede control of the world's maritime industry and global supply chains to China in perpetuity. They even talk about the risk of a century of shame. Now, is this currently being echoed in White House thinking? No, nowhere near. Could it percolate up as we have seen in previous years with protectionism and trade wars? Yes, it could, and it would change things hugely if it does. How? Well, if the neoliberal consensus of too big to sail and just doing business as usual gets thrown overboard, it will not be a barrel of laughs for a lot of people. Let me explain what I think we could see. Here is the best value pun so far, I think, in the presentation. Hopefully it will wake you up this morning, the ship of things to come. These are examples from US maritime history we could see repeated. The US could use its market size to force shippers to change pricing, to force carriers to change pricing. They could raise tariffs. They could refuse to take goods from Chinese or European ships or pro-China, pro-EU ports. I'm throwing the EU in there just as an example of someone who isn't seen as on the US side in a hypothetical scenario. They could force vessels to reflag from Panama. Do you know how much it costs to do that? About $13,500 a day. That's not very much when you compare it to the budget of the Pentagon. So that could happen. They could build a rival to China's Belt and Road at sea, together with Australia, India, Japan, etc., the UK. They could rebuild their maritime marine. Now, could they do it with their current shipbuilding capacity? Maybe not. Maybe they could build new shipbuilding capacity. They could enter the grey zone between war and peace. They could charter, for example, Amazon or Google or Elon Musk to say, bring in all the goods we need to go green from Africa using your own ships, and anything you do to get it here is legal. Privateering, that used to be called. Or the US Navy could say, you know what, we're only going to protect the nationalities that are on our side. All other ships, you can attack them if you want, pirates. Or they'll only protect certain sea lanes to force other countries to have to step up. That's less likely, I think, but I'm just showing you some examples from history. Now, which ones are we already seeing in action? We're already seeing that. We're already seeing that. We're already seeing that. So some of them are happening, maybe the others won't, but we're already seeing things being shaken up. And we see headlines like this, for example, in Forbes magazine, arguing that really the US needs a merchant fleet again, and a certain percentage of US trade should be carried on US flagged vessels. Well, welcome to 1789. In New Zealand, they're talking about maybe setting up a national shipping line. In Thailand, they're talking about the same thing. Now, I'm not predicting these things will necessarily happen, but people are starting to think about carriers for shipping in exactly the same way that they think about national carriers in terms of airlines. Same kind of role. And I wonder how long until we see this World War II recruitment poster for the US Merchant Marine being reinvented for the 21st century. I wonder. So then part 6, to conclude. Many ports are in a storm over this, rather than any port in a storm, as we say in English. Here are the key conclusions. From a strategic overview, Shipping snarls are here to stay for a long time. They'll get much worse if the US in particular throws in more stimulus. It's questionable whether inflation views can stay low and supply chains can stay fixed. Resolving the constraints is itself constrained by a battle between geopolitics, which says, let's get resilient and bring supply chains home, and too big to sail, which says, no, let's stick with what we already know. That's the pre-crisis model, which has helped create this crisis, but we're just going to double down, which is what we did in banking, by the way, with too big to fail. Going green will make everything more expensive. It already is. The Cold War means very fat tail risks of things getting very hot. And history strongly suggests at some point a US policy shift to retain commercial maritime power, because to have military maritime power and not to make any money out of it is logically inconsistent. So everyone, though, is sitting on the vessel, looking at the sails, waiting for the wind to fill them and blow us somewhere. We're just drifting for now. The next big step could blow us towards decoupling, or worse, or something very different. But for now, as I said, we're just drifting. And for the industry itself, clearly, this is boom time, but there are storms on the horizon. I would suggest we're going to see much more integration, given everything is getting more political. So big carriers will try and buy small for further industry consolidation. Retailers are already looking at running their own ships. Carriers are looking at running their own chassis, in the US at least. Governments are looking at carriers. You could argue maybe some carriers are pressurizing some governments. The more of this chain you control, the stronger you are during the realpolitik clash that is to come. But of course, a lot of money is going to be spent. A lot of money is going to be spent. The question is, on what? Of what scale? Going from where to where? That is the key issue. And there are huge supply chain risks if you get this wrong, and huge opportunities if you get it right. And so I conclude with this very, very simple message. As an industry, as a firm, as an individual, are you going to get involved? Or are you just going to wait and see? Thank you very much.